Hello everybody, and thanks for tuning in. This is the last video for Unit 3 on populations, and today we're going to talk about the demographic transition, which is a process that demographers use to describe what happens to a nation's population as they develop. As they grow and they become more wealthy and more self-sufficient, we see a predictable change in their population. So the formal definition is as follows. As a country moves from a subsistence economy where they're growing and farming just to survive towards industrialization and increased wealth, increased technology, that population or that country goes through a predictable shift in population growth. And the demographic transition is broken up into 4 stages, sometimes 5, but for purposes of our class we're going to do it in these 4, and the names can differ. The first stage is pre-industrial, second phase is transitional, the third phase is the industrial phase, and the last phase is post-industrial. Pretty self-explanatory. And what I want to do now is zoom in on each phase and look at what's happening in each phase and how that's going to impact the population. So in order to do that, we need to do one of my favorite things, the best way to visualize data and change over time. We need to graph it. So first thing we need to do is we need to set up our axes. Our x-axis is time, and our y-axes are going to be the crude birth rate, which I will do in green, and the crude death rate, which I'm going to do in red. And just a reminder, those are the number of births per 1,000 individuals and the number of deaths per 1,000 individuals in the population. And then I'm going to break this graph up into 4 segments, which each segment representing one of the phases. And we're going to plot the crude birth and death rates in each phase over time. So let's start with the pre-industrial phase. This is a country that has undergone very little developed. It's what we would refer to as probably an underdeveloped country. It's usually a young country. The old term that is no longer really socially acceptable is a third world country, because that implies they're inferior in some way, when in actuality they're just younger, or earlier stages of growth. So in the pre-industrial phase, we see high birth rates and also high death rates, right? This ultimately is because of a variety of reasons, but there is high child mortality, and so people are having lots of babies to offset that child mortality, right? But also there's a very low life expectancy. People aren't living very long, and child are seen as an important source of labor. That's both in terms of working on the farm and helping out around the house. You can think of, I encourage you to think about the United States on this timeline, right? Our pre-industrial phase is probably like up until the late 1700s, early to mid 1800s. We were in the pre-industrial phase. And then in the transitional phase, what happens is that the death rate starts to drop. And over time, it will drop substantially. That's due to a variety of factors, right? Reduced infant mortality, increased life expectancy, all due to increased technology, better medicine, better healthcare, better education, etc. But the birth rate kind of stays the same. Doesn't really drop as quickly. There's a lag there. Like I said, improved health and technology, and infant mortality lowers, life expectancy increases. And then as we enter the industrial phase, so this is probably right around the start of the Industrial Revolution. And then once we enter the industrial phase, at least in the United States, which is probably in the, I don't know, late 1800s, I would guess. I'm not a history teacher, so you'll have to fact check me on that one. The death rate kind of bottoms out and reaches like an all-time low. It'll kind of stay that low through the industrial phase, and the birth rate will catch up. It will continue to drop as the country's wealth or the population's wealth continues to grow. Kids become less necessary. Their role as labor and help around the house, around the farm, becomes less important as things become mechanized and automated, etc. And so the birth rate is going to drop. And ultimately, when we enter the post-industrial phase, which you could make the argument that's where the United States is now, although you could also make the argument that they're still in the industrial phase. The death rate is going to fluctuate a little bit, and the birth rate's also going to fluctuate. One goes up, the other goes down, but for the most part, they're both going to stay relatively low. This is because at this point, kids are expensive, and so people are having fewer of them. The birth rate is about equivalent to the death rate, and there's very high education, very affluent population with advanced technology, etc. So what we see is this interesting pattern where the death rate will drop and then the birth rate lags behind that a little bit and drops a little bit later on. So what I want you to think about now is the population. when is the population growing, when is it shrinking, and when is it staying the same, right? Anytime the green line is above the red line, there's going to be population growth. So in the pre-industrial phase, there's not really a lot of growth going on. But here, we see a big difference between the two. So if we put population on the y-axis, this time in black, and we graph that, it's going to look like, well, a logistic curve, right? We're a K-selected species. So early on, the population is pretty stable, pretty low, but then the death rate starts to drop, birth rate still stays high, so the population is going to grow. And at this point, I drew this curve in PowerPoint, but take my word for it. This is an exponential curve. This is where the fastest growth is happening in the transitional phase. As we enter the industrial phase, the birth rate, got to plug in. The birth rate starts to drop, and the population growth starts to slow until eventually we reach the post-industrial phase, where it starts to level off, and in fact, it might even start to shrink towards the end of the post-industrial phase as people are having fewer and fewer children, and it might actually mean the population is shrinking. All right, I got to get my laptop charger. Give me 2 seconds here. Okay. I should plan ahead next time, but that's too much to be asked. Alrighty. Maybe I'll cut this out. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm savvy enough to figure out how to cut this out. All right, I'm plugged in. Good to go. Boom! We're back, baby. All right, so I'm going to show you some actual graphs of this rather than the one I made in PowerPoint, so you can see a little bit more clearly what the demographic transition looks like. And here's one example, right? Pre-industrial, transitional, industrial, and post-industrial. Time and growth rate for births in green and deaths in red. And you can see that early on, births and deaths kind of fluctuate a little bit, but in transitional stage, death rate starts to drop due to increased food, improved medical care, etc., vaccines, longer life expectancies. The birth rate still stays high, so we see a lot of population growth happening here. And as the birth rate starts to decline, as smaller families become more valuable is the wrong word, but as ideal, people are more interested in having smaller families rather than larger families. Not to mention women are getting better access to education, birth control, they can focus on their careers, so the birth rate starts to drop, and the population growth starts to slow, and then eventually in the post-industrial phase they will fluctuate a little bit. So what I want to look at a couple phenomena here, mostly in the transitional and industrial phases. First of all, in the transitional phase, why is the birth rate so high, right? Why doesn't it drop immediately with the death rate? And there are a variety of reasons why that could be the case. No country is going to have the same exact pattern, right? But there are some common factors we could identify. First of all, children are valuable, right? They provide a source of labor, and they can care for the parents when the parents get older. So even though the death rate is dropping, it still might be financially or socially valuable to have many kids to help around. Additionally, at this point, the birth rate might be high because there's not much sex education, family planning, contraceptives, access to family planning services, etc. So the birth rate is not going to be as in check, so to speak. There might be a culture that the culture in the area might value having larger families. There might be religious pressures that value having larger families. They might be compensating for high infant mortality while the death rate overall is dropping. Infant mortality can still be relatively high, so maybe families are compensating for that. So those are a variety of reasons why the birth rate is so high here, but eventually it does start to drop, and it drops rather slowly. It doesn't drop super duper fast compared to the death rate. And why might that be? Similar reasons to what we were just talking about. There could be cultural or religious reasons that say value having large families or prohibit things like birth control, right? Some religions may inhibit the use of contraceptive devices or family planning and things like that. And female empowerment may be slow to take root within the culture at this phase. Whether it's access to education for women, allowing women to focus on their careers and get employed, acceptance of women as equal to men in some cultures may take longer than in other cultures. And so it might take a little bit longer for the female empowerment movement to take root. It could also be that birth control, while it is being produced, it's being produced very slowly, like in the factories. And it could be that there are policies that support the elderly, like Social Security and Medicaid and stuff like that, might be slow to be implemented, so that way ultimately the population growth is still pretty high. Another thing we can look at that we've already talked about are population pyramids, and we can kind of line these up with each phase of demographic transition. In the pre-industrial phase, we see a high birth rate, but as you go up, the cohort gets smaller and smaller, which indicates the high death rates and short life expectancy. But as the country develops into the transitional phase, more of these individuals are surviving into the next cohort, so the base of the pyramid starts to widen out. The population is growing very, very fast at this point, right? More people are living, and they're living longer. As they move into the industrial phase, the birth rate starts to decline a little bit. People are living longer. You can see the top of the pyramid is wider than it was in the past. And finally, as you get into the post-industrial phase, you still see that same phenomena where lots of people are making it to much later in life, but you actually also start to see a drop in the birth rate, fewer kids, as the need or the want for kids starts to drop, and you might actually see the population shrinking. Here are some examples of countries that are actually in this phase. Angola is in the pre-industrial phase. Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh are in the transitional phase. India and Libya are in the industrial phase. And Japan, Italy, and maybe even the United States are in the post-industrial phase. You can make the argument that the United States is somewhere in between these two phases, which is why some people look at 5 different phases for the model, but we're only going to look at 4. You can sort of line them up and take a look at the population growth, this orange line here, and compare it to the pyramids. But that's pretty much it for the demographic transition, right? Make sure you're familiar with each phase, what the crude birth rate and crude death rate is like in each phase, what the population growth rate is like in each phase. You can see, again, exponential growth here in the transitional phase and starts to slow down in the industrial phase. And also think about what is causing these changes, right? Education, healthcare, contraceptives, etc., stuff we've been talking about all year. If you've got questions, let me know. I'll bring them to class. We'll do some practice, and we will go from there. Thanks for your time.